talked to an individual, as far as just getting into the sermonette, I talked to an individual this past week by the name of Paul Spencer. Paul lives in Sweden, and he's thinking of coming to the Feast of Tabernacles in Estonia. He was there last year, and he spoke a couple of times and spoke very well. So I mentioned to him that we would appreciate him being able to speak at the feast this year. Paul said, well, you know, it's really stressful if you only speak one time a year to come and try to speak then. And I said, Paul, and I'm sure some of you who speak rather frequently will identify with this, it doesn't matter how many times I've been speaking, going back until 1980, it's always stressful to me to be able to speak. And I guess I would say, I didn't say this to Paul, but I guess I would say this, in the event that I didn't feel a certain level of stress, then I would imagine that I shouldn't be speaking at all. Speaking is always going to be stressful, and if you take it as seriously as you should, it's going to be stressful. Sermonette today is kind of what you have to do when there is stress to control the situation. I entitled the sermonette, Be Bold. And all of us have times when we need to be bold. And all of us have times when it is difficult to be bold. There was a whole society here in Estonia when we first came in 1997 that didn't have an attitude of being bold at all. They wouldn't so much as look at you on the streets. They turned their gaze away from you, held their head down, and just walked around in that way. At the time, there was an individual here by the name of Ulo Maring, and I, by the way, just got, if any of you know something about Ulo, I just got a returned envelope from Ulo this past week, and written on the envelope was that Ulo had died. So sometime between February and when I returned, Ulo had died, and he was kind of like the most long-standing Sabbath keeper in the area. I asked Ulo in 1997 what Estonians thought of Americans. Ulo looked at me for a minute, kind of frowned his head, brought his brow together a little bit, and he said in his best English, which was not as good conversationally as he was in reading English. He could read and write English pretty well, but speaking it, he hadn't had as much practice with his pronunciations. Ulo said to me, though, to us, you Americans are just like hyenas. I thought, why did he say that? And then subsequently, as I was walking down the street, you know, I noticed that we smiled pretty easily and looked around at the people as we passed by, and they always looked down and away from us. And I came to the understanding that over 40, 50 years, they had been intimidated by the communists, and they were afraid to even smile at people. They were just the opposite of what I'm talking here. They were a contrast, a study in contrast to the idea of being bold. Of course, that was understandable. They had a nation of about 500,000 adults, and the communists had killed 250,000. At least that's according to the history books. I'm not sure how you would know, but that's what the history books had said. 250,000. So you could see how that might have made it a little bit difficult to be bold. I also thought about this in regard to being bold. We went to a ministerial conference some years back. Don Ward asked for a question. Dr. Don Ward asked a question and asked for people to answer that question. And nobody was willing to put forth their idea on the answer, even though he had sent the question out in advance. So he finally said, "Be bold, man. Speak up." It is a proper thing to be bold. I'd like to look at 2 examples and 1 instruction in the Bible about being bold. So let's look at that in this sermonette. First of all is the example that Christ set for us about being bold. John chapter 7 and verse 25. We find here it's reported that Christ spoke openly about the truth and about the things which he understood and knew. Of course, he had a depth of understanding we don't have, and so his attitude of boldness was not something we could really conceive of, since he had come down from heaven and had been a part of everything that went before mankind and the creation of all of the universe. So he had a foundation in boldness that we don't have. But he set us an example. And we should, like he did, be bold. That's what Peter said. Christ set us an example that we should follow after him in all things. Paul also said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." John chapter 7 and verse 25. Then said some of them of Jerusalem. Well, by this I would perceive that there was pretty much a wide discussion among the people in Jerusalem about Christ. And he was getting into a conflict with all of the religious leaders, and they were trying to put him to death. Yet he continued to speak in a bold way. Said some of them of Jerusalem, "Is this not he whom they seek to kill? Lo, he speaks boldly, and they say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is the very Christ?" Christ was, first of all, well reasoned in everything that he said. And of course, if we're going to be bold, we don't want to be bold unless we are confident, very confident, that what we're saying is true. But if we can be very confident of what we say, and we should gain our confidence from the pages of the Bible, if we are very confident of what we say, then we should do as Christ did and speak boldly about it, and not be afraid to speak about it. Often we may be rather intimidated for one reason or another and not as bold as we might otherwise be. So Christ was he's our example. He was well reasoned, and he was bold. Peter and John, following the crucifixion of Christ, and there are other examples of boldness that we could have selected, but I selected this next example. Peter and John, we find in the book of Acts chapter 4. They had, following the day of Pentecost, we're following the day of Pentecost. This was apparently fairly soon after the day of Pentecost. They continued to baptize people, and they continued to preach and speak in the temple, and they healed people publicly in a very, I don't say ostentatious, but a very public kind of way that was recognized by people. And so they were being very bold in their faith. They were proclaiming Christ in Jerusalem. Now, as they did that, they became much more under attack by the elders in Jerusalem, and those people who had brought Christ before them tried him and condemned him to be crucified. And so they brought Peter and John. They arrested Peter and John. And then they threatened them. They beat them and threatened them and told them not to go out and speak about Christ anymore. Well, Peter and John said, we will speak about Christ. And so the boldness, Acts chapter 4, verse 13, when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were unlearned and ignorant men, they weren't unlearned and ignorant men, they just weren't learned in the institutions of the time, they marveled. And they took knowledge of them that they had been with Jesus. So it was their boldness that made them effective servants. And we need to be bold in our understanding and belief. I don't mean to say that we ought to go down to Times Square and stand up on the corner and hold a sign up which says, "Repent from the wrath to come." I mean, I've seen that down on the street corners in New York City, Times Square. So I'm not saying that. That's not boldness according to knowledge, but boldness in the proper way is something that we need to have. John and Peter had set that example for us. Their effectiveness depended on the fact that they were bold. In fact, their release depended on the fact that they were bold. They were beaten and released, but they were afraid to do anything more to them. The leaders in Jerusalem were afraid to do any more to Peter and John because they had been so bold and because the people recognized them. So they were beaten, but they were released, and they were instructed vehemently not to speak in the name of Christ, which they continue to do. So in that way, they set for us an example as well, that we need to be bold and not to be intimidated by other people. The first two examples were boldness before the world and before those people who may not have a calling from God. And we need to be bold and show our faith and the truth of God to those people in the proper way. The instruction that I have is also an instruction about boldness. Paul gives this instruction to us. I wouldn't say it's the only place you can find it, but it is an instruction about being bold before God. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. Paul says, we do not have a high priest, Jesus Christ is our high priest, but we do not have a high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. Christ suffered as a physical human being, And so he learned to appreciate the feelings that we have, which come out of our weaknesses, the feelings of our infirmities. He was in all points tempted like as we are, but without sin. Paul says in verse 16, let us therefore referring back to what we read in the verse before, because we have a high priest who can understand, we can come boldly before the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace in time of need. This can reflect, I don't say that it always should reflect, but in a time of need, boldness before the throne of grace is something that Paul instructs us here that we are to have. So that's an instruction about boldness. We have the two examples of boldness, but we could have selected many more. And we have this instruction about, at least at the appropriate time, we are to be bold when we approach Christ.